I'm going to let you in on a little bit of a secret. Artists as a whole, the whole profession of, being an artist, of drawing pictures and painting and all that, it's built on the idea that all artists are liars. It's what we do, and we do a very good job of it. Everything that we do is built around the idea that we need to lie to our audience. We need to take something that is inherently flat, a flat drawing, a flat canvas. Maybe there's a little bit of bumpy paint on it, but it's still flat. And we need to convey the illusion that it is not exactly what you see before you, that you do not see a simple collection of flat lines on a surface, but rather you see a whole scene unfolding before you that delves into the very depth of what you're looking at, a full three-dimensional world. And most people understand that. And I mean, I'm sure you do, but the thing is, that's the problem. When you're drawing, you are fully aware of the fact that, maybe not quite in those harsh terms that we're all liars, but you understand that you're constructing an illusion. You understand that you are actually just drawing lines on a page and that they're coming together to create an illusion of something greater. But the problem is that you understand that. And as we move through these lessons and as you learn to draw, what happens is that you start to develop a belief in your own lie. When you're telling someone a tall tale, just, lying about something big or small, there are things that happen that are either going to sway the person that you're telling or that you're speaking to towards believing you or thinking that you're just full of it. As you tell your story, the things that you say will either line up with each other in small, subtle ways, or there will be little contradictions in everything that you do. That's what sets apart someone who's good at lying and who's bad at lying. But the person who is great at lying, the best liar out there, is the person who believes their lie is true. If the entirety of your lie is so fundamentally a part of your worldview, if you believe it to such an extent, then there is nothing that you can say to someone that is going to contradict that lie, because everything you say is going to be built on that foundation of untruth. And so if we're applying that to drawing, we need to go from looking at what we're doing as putting lines on a page to actually constructing a solid series of solid forms within a three-dimensional space. We need to start taking the page that we're drawing on and looking at it as though it's not the limiting element, it's not a limited space that we're working in. We need to think of it as though it is a window to a much larger world. So let's take a look at this diagram from the lesson. It's pretty simple. It's some sort of a swooping ribbon with a little arrowhead at the end. But there are a lot of techniques here that I employed, not consciously, but because I believed what I was drawing was going to be an arrow that was winding back and forth and plunging into the depths of space, of the space that I have to work in. So there are a few things here that I've done that we're going to talk about. First of all, the obvious one. This arrow starts out pretty big. It's pretty wide. And as it kind of swoops in through space, it gets skinnier and skinnier, and it keeps getting skinnier. But the thing is, your brain does not necessarily perceive it that way, because your brain is used to looking at the world as a two-dimensional projection. Your eyes see the world, and then your brain processes the images that it gets, which are largely two-dimensional. It understands that if something is farther away, or rather if something is small, that doesn't necessarily mean that object is just small. It could be farther away. And so we're tricking the brain into thinking that instead of this being just a ribbon that kind of, if laid flat, we're going like this, instead, the brain immediately thinks, no, it makes a lot more sense for this ribbon to be a single consistent width than for that to be the case, because this requires more work. This kind of tapering ribbon, it's abnormal. It doesn't make sense. It's not something that would generally exist unless it had a specific reason to exist. And so the simpler solution is that it is an arrow that goes back into space. There are other features here, however, that complement this idea. And so as the brain comes up with all of this evidence, it pieces together a view and an understanding of what it's looking at, and it decides, you know what, the evidence says that this is an arrow going into space. I'm looking at something three-dimensional, not a flat drawing. So another thing is that the distance between these sections of the arrow steadily gets skinnier. It's not quite as visible between these two, but when you go back here, there's very little space between the arrow, the last length of this arrow and the length before it. There's quite a bit here, and there's even more here. That space is getting compressed, and our brain understands that's what perspective does. There's more tricks. Look at these simple horizontal lines. They don't even need to be in the scene, but they help. They help sell the same lie that everything else is trying to sell, and it does it doing the same trick as before. There's less space here, a little bit more, a little bit more, a lot more. And so you're piecing together a lie with many different components, and the brain decides, no, I know what's going on. This is three-dimensional. There's actually one mistake that I did make, though. The thickness of this arrowhead, the line here, is frankly too thick, and it's a bit of a contradiction, because the brain understands that, wait, why would the line there be any thicker? Like, why would it be so broad if the arrow is just moving further away? The line weight should also be shrinking to match. And so that's a contradiction that risks breaking the illusion. It doesn't completely break it, thankfully, because there's enough evidence piling up in favor of this being three-dimensional. But without a lot of that, if we were just looking at this and maybe just the fact that it was that the ribbon was getting skinnier as it went, that might not be enough to offset this mistake, this contradiction, enough to make it believable. And so there are frequently those kinds of mistakes that we'll make. And the more and more that we believe that what we are drawing is actually three-dimensional, the less we have to think in order to keep our story straight. There's one other little trick that I want to share with you before I finish this video off. And that is something that we can use to make something flat look three-dimensional. Here we've got a flat shape. It's pretty straightforward. There's nothing here to suggest to us that it's not flat. But if we were to add some lines, like these, all of a sudden, even with just these lines, there's enough there to make us think, you know what, maybe this isn't flat. Because immediately we start thinking that these lines are running along the surface of an object. That if you were to take this, what now looks like a sausage form, and lay it flat, the brain likes to think everything is being a simple grid. Lines do not rotate, they do not curve, they are just straight. And if you were then to take this flattened out sausage, or however it would look, maybe something a little bit more like this, or whatever. If you were to then roll that up, the straight lines that we have here would start to curve similarly to how they do here. And so our brain, because it wants certain things to be certain ways to be able to understand it more easily, will immediately jump to the conclusion that, oh no, this is a rounded three-dimensional form. It inherently believes that marks that are on top of it are running along the surface of the form as long as you keep to certain limits. If you were to have that same kind of sausage form, but then you put these curves that kind of floated outside or too far inside or something like that, there's no illusion there, there's no trickery. It's clearly not resting on the surface of this form. So the illusion isn't very strong, or it's not really even there. But here, because we've kept these curves snugly fitting within the sausage form, then we can believe that these lines run along the surface of the given form, and therefore they describe how it actually warps through three-dimensional space. You can go even further. You can make bumps appear that are not there. Now we're starting to imply that there's a whole mass right here. That, of course, becomes much clearer when I outline it like that, but even without that outline, there starts to be a suggestion that, oh, there's something there that I'm not quite seeing. Now, the silhouette would generally change if there was a bump there to be even more believable. But that's one step that you can take to reinforce it. Just like we were talking about with this, having so many different techniques, making the ribbon get skinnier, the space compressing between the lengths of this ribbon, and even having these horizontal lines serving no purpose but to reinforce this illusion. Each little trick that you use is going to help sell the illusion and make your viewer buy into the lie. And at the same time, it's going to help you believe in the lie. A lot of the techniques basically build around that concept. We've talked a little bit about drawing through forms in the past. We do that for our box challenge, and I mentioned it in lesson 1. That's something that helps us to understand how these forms exist in 3D space, but it also tells us more about how they, it effectively helps us to believe that they're three-dimensional in the first place, because we can start to understand it better. Then there's, later on in this lesson, one of the exercises, one of the more difficult ones, is form intersections, where we start fleshing out just how two forms actually intersect with one another. Defining those specific intersections is another trick that helps us to believe that these are actually solid forms that are interacting with one another. If you just paste them on top of each other, there's less of an understanding there that this is happening at all. They could just be flat stickers on a page. And so these are all tricks that we are going to use and leverage as we go to convey these illusions, convince ourselves more than anything else, so that we can make all the subtle little changes without even realizing it that help keep the story straight, and then ultimately to sell that to to our audience. Some of these techniques you can't always use because sometimes there isn't room for them. For example, the sausage form that we were drawing, maybe we need to draw like a hot dog sausage, and maybe we're not really in a position to be able to excuse these random cross-sectional lines existing. And so in those cases, we're kind of limited in what tools we can use. But because every single exercise and every drawing that we do for Drawabox is an exercise, the use of the contour lines will help us to understand, or at least see the world as being, see these drawings as being three-dimensional. And so we start to leverage little subtler tools that we may not even be conscious of, but once we start believing in them, they become a part of just how we draw. And I'll show you one example of that because it's kind of a vague and not entirely clear concept, but I will show you one example of that. Here you can see two paintings of, they're simple renderings. This one's a persimmon, and then this one is just a simple sphere. As you can see here, if you look really closely, you'll see that the brush strokes that I've done actually follow the curvature of the form. And here as well. They run along the surface, even though I know that I'm painting just on a flat canvas. Because I understand and I believe that this form is three-dimensional, it is effectively impossible, or at least very difficult, once I've come to believe that if I were to tell myself, okay, draw a line across this form, I'm not going to draw a line that goes straight across like one might for a simple flat shape. My brain is immediately going to tell me, no, it's a three-dimensional object. So of course it wraps around. It runs along the surface of the form because there's no other way for that to be possible. And so your brain tricks you because you believe in the illusion to wrap these strokes around the form. So if you're painting, which some of you will ultimately want to get into, digital painting or otherwise, understanding and believing in the illusion that you're creating is critical, because you're going to make all these subconscious decisions. None of them were consciously. I didn't sit there and decide every single paint stroke I was putting down where it was going to go. I already understood the illusion that I was creating was real, and therefore I had to follow it and keep in line with it and keep from contradicting it. One of the biggest mistakes that I see people make is that they might be drawing a sphere, but they will shade it with cross-hatching like this. Each of these little lines serves as a contour line that is describing the surface of the form. If these lines are straight, it's basically telling us that this is not a sphere or a ball. It's telling us that it's a flat circle and nothing more than that. So always keep that in mind. As you continue to work through these lessons, keep pushing yourself to believe that these forms that you're creating are solid and three-dimensional. It will take time, and it takes practice, and it's something that gradually creeps in on you as you continue to work through the exercises. But always try and remind yourself in the back of your head that what I'm drawing is not just a collection of lines. As always, this is just a summary of what's presented on the website. The link will be in the description below for this particular page of the lesson. I do repeat most of what I've said here on that lesson, but it's much easier for me to update any content that needs changing there. And there's a lot more detail, and I get into it much more. So check that out.